In the desolate Nevada desert, Walt Jennings, known as Whiskey J, broadcast nightly on an ancient AM radio. A Vietnam War signal specialist haunted by personal loss, Walt maintains this ritual despite believing no one listens. Meanwhile, halfway across the world, a U.S. Special Operations team, Echo 6, is trapped in Afghanistan, their communications crippled by a devastating cyber attack. With all modern systems down, Lieutenant Avery Knox at the Pentagon uncovers Walt's obscure frequency, the only signal still alive. As Echo 6's desperate plea cuts through Walt's static, he realizes he's no longer broadcasting to silence. Will this 82-year-old relic be their unlikely lifeline? Story of quiet persistence and unwavering duty moved you. Please show your support. Like this video, subscribe to our channel for more inspiring tales, and share it with someone who believes that even one voice can make a world of difference. Your support helps us keep telling these powerful stories. Thank you for listening. Out in the barren stretch of desert, a faint, trembling hum crackled through an old radio receiver, breaking the heavy stillness like a whispered memory. Inside a weather-beaten shack, more wire than wood, an old man hunched over a cluttered desk, eyes narrowing behind thick lenses as he carefully turned the frequency dial. Echo 6 position compromised. Need evac. Anyone copy? The voice on the radio was ragged with urgency. The old man pressed the mic button without hesitation. This is Whiskey J. I hear you. The line sputtered. Static burst into a sudden pop. Sparks jumped from the control panel like startled fireflies. The overhead light blinked once and thawed, but the old man didn't flinch. Calmly, he reached under the desk and flipped a switch. The backup generator coughed, then rumbled to life, flooding the shack with dim yellow light. Let's see if this old ghost can still shout, he muttered to himself. Outside, the signal pierced the dark, a fragile pulse of sound echoing across empty sand and night sky. It was the only voice still broadcasting, and someone, somewhere, was listening. People had their names for him. A ghost on the wind, a leftover from another era, or just the old man in the shack. His real name was Walter Jennings, though most who remembered him called him Walt. And on the radio, he was always Whiskey J. 82 years old, Walt lived alone, far out on the ragged edge of the Nevada desert. His closest neighbor lived a mile of dirt road and at least 10 years of silence away. There was no cell phone in the house, no television flickering in the background. His mailbox was a rusted old ammo can bolted to a fence post that hadn't seen a letter since the Clinton administration. But Walt had one thing that still worked, one thing he trusted, one thing he lived for: his radio. Every evening as the sun drained the color from the desert and the shadows stretched out like ghosts, Walt powered up the small AM transmitter he'd built himself, painstakingly reassembled over 4 decades from salvaged parts. The vacuum tubes glowed like coals. The antenna hissed, reaching invisible arms toward the stars. And the tiny red on-air bulb above his desk blinked to life with a tired but determined flicker. Walt would clear his throat, lean forward, and speak into the mic with the same slow, measured rhythm he'd used for nearly 3 decades. This is Whiskey J, broadcasting from the silence. Then came the stillness, not emptiness, but a kind of sacred pause. The soft, steady hiss of AM static rolled across the dark like distant surf. No music, no ads, just that voice and that low hum, a heartbeat buried under sand and time. The frequency he used was 760 kHz on the low-band AM dial, the kind of signal you'd only catch if your car was old enough and the night was clear and quiet. Not many people listened anymore. The folks in Carson Ridge, the nearest town, still remembered him, kind of. At the diner, he was a punchline. Still talking to ghosts, that one. Old man thinks he's calling the moon. The younger crowd didn't even know what AM radio was, let alone why anyone would bother with it. Spotify had drowned the airwaves. Podcasts had buried them. But Walt didn't care. He wasn't chasing listeners. He wasn't clinging to some dusty nostalgia. For him, this wasn't about being heard. It was ritual. It was a rhythm worn so deep into his soul that it needed no reason. Just repetition. Once upon a time, long before the desert and the shack, Walt had served as a signal specialist in the U.S. Army during the Vietnam War. He hadn't carried a rifle. He didn't fire on enemy lines, but he was the guy who could fix a busted transmitter while rounds zipped overhead. The guy who could wring life from a dead signal with nothing but foil, a bent paperclip, and a prayer. He worked forward comms for field units stationed in places like Kang Tree and Pleiku, outposts deep in enemy territory, places where silence could mean death. Walt could read radio static like another man might read tea leaves. It was his job to listen, really listen, through walls of static and chaos. His mission, to make sure the desperate voices got through, that someone heard, that help came. He remembered every voice. Some screamed, some whispered, some were cut off in the middle of a sentence and he never heard from them again. When the war ended, Walt came home. He got a job in telecommunications, settled into a quieter life. He married Margaret. They had a son, Eddie. On the surface, it looked like the signal had stopped, but the voice inside never did. The need to keep the line open never left him. So he built his own system, right there in the middle of nowhere. And every single night since, he went on the air. Not for money, not for fame, but because you don't switch off the signal while the world's still turning. Even if no one's out there, even if the silence answers back. Because maybe, just maybe someday someone would call. And when they did, Walt would be there, still listening, still steady, still sending out his voice into the dark. Walter Jennings never fired a shot in battle, but he saved lives, dozens of them. Not with bullets, but with copper wire, a microphone, and a hand that never trembled. Walt Jennings didn't need to crawl through trenches or run recon to feel the war pressing in around him. While others fought under open skies, he was elbow deep in broken transmitters and fried comm gear, coaxing sparks of life from dead machines. He didn't have to see the front lines. They came to him in broken whispers, chopped transmissions, and the staccato tap of Morse code barely threading through the thrum of jungle noise. Walt lived behind the curtain, unseen but vital, tracing signals, rerouting lost calls, guiding medevac choppers through thick clouds and enemy fire. Even back then, people knew his name, or at least his call sign, Whiskey J. It was more than just a handle, it was a lifeline. His commanding officer once said, "If you can't reach command, call Whiskey J. He'll find you." And Walt always did. Every voice that crackled through his headset stayed with him. Some came panicked, others barely audible beneath the rasp of blood and pain. A few were disturbingly calm, resigned in the way only a dying man could be. Walt wrote down every one of them in a small black notebook he carried tucked inside his rucksack. Unit numbers, coordinates, times. Some he marked with a star. Those were the ones who made it out. Others he underlined, men lost before help could get there. He never forgot. When the war ended and he came home in 1973, the notebook went into a drawer. He didn't talk about it. Not with his wife, Margaret, and not with his son, Eddie. Eddie was everything Walt had ever hoped a son would be. Bright, kind, grounded. A good man. When he chose to enlist, Walt felt a mix of pride and unease. Eddie didn't go into comms like his father. He picked infantry, said he wanted to be where it mattered. Walt didn't fight him on it, but deep down he carried a truth Eddie hadn't learned yet. War doesn't stay on the battlefield. It clings to your boots, hides in your lungs. It whispers to you long after the radio's gone quiet. In '91, Eddie deployed with his unit during Operation Desert Storm. He was leading a convoy patrol through the Kuwaiti desert when a roadside IED obliterated the lead vehicle. Eddie died instantly. 2 days later, Walt heard the knock every soldier's parent dreads. A folded flag, rehearsed words delivered by a young officer who had no idea what kind of man he was standing in front of. Margaret never recovered. Within a year, she was gone too. Stroke, the doctor said. Walt didn't blame her heart. He blamed the silence. The house had been too quiet after Eddie died. Too hollow. Too still. One night, overwhelmed by the weight of it all, Walt did something he hadn't done in nearly 20 years. He went out to the garage, dragged out old boxes, and dug through rusted parts. Transmitters, coaxial cables, vacuum tubes, a soldering kit. Then, in the stillness of the Nevada desert behind his house, he raised a new antenna. It wasn't as tall as the jungle towers he'd built in Vietnam, but it was just as sturdy. He rewired everything from scratch. No digital components, no internet. just analog bones and ghost circuits. That night, he flipped the switch, watched the dials come alive. Then he keyed the mic and spoke into the dark. "This is Whiskey J, broadcasting from the silence." He didn't expect anyone to answer. That wasn't why he did it. He broadcast every night after that, not to talk, not even to be heard, but as a way to say to the world, "I'm still here. I haven't quit." As long as the antenna stood, as long as the radio's hum floated through the still Nevada air, Whiskey J remained on the airwaves, constant, steady, a flicker of life in the static. Half a world away, in the unforgiving terrain straddling the Afghanistan-Pakistan border, 6 American soldiers were running out of time. Echo 6, a covert special ops team, had been deployed on a high-risk surveillance mission. Their objective was to gather intel on a suspected weapons transfer linked to regional insurgents. It was supposed to be a quick 72-hour in-and-out op. No contact, no firefight, just eyes on, record, extract. But on the second night, everything unraveled. Their cover was blown. Just after midnight, tracer rounds lit up the hillside where they'd set up camp. By dawn, 2 team members were wounded, and the unit had retreated into a narrow ravine, cut off and surrounded by rock and hostile terrain. Their field transmitter still showed connection, but there was no reply. Only static. Dead air. That was the first sign this wasn't just a routine comms failure. Something much larger was happening. And far away, deep inside a fortified wing of the Pentagon, buried beneath the buzz of fluorescent lights and encrypted terminals, the situation was already beginning to spiral. Red lights flared to life across the command center, blinking furiously on every screen. Alerts screamed in sharp, repetitive pulses. Within seconds, a full communications blackout began crawling like a virus across every major military network. At first, they assumed localized interference, maybe classic enemy jamming. Routine expected. But then, as the cascade spread faster than any known tactic, reality sank in. Analysts scrambled through diagnostic logs, fingers flying over keyboards, until the truth hit. Clear, inescapable. This wasn't random. It wasn't a glitch. It was a deliberate, synchronized cyber attack. One by one, the systems collapsed. First, the secure SATCOM links went dead. UHF bands dropped out next, totally unresponsive. VHF followed, but worse, scrambled beyond recovery, like the signal had been chewed up and spit out by ghosts. Backup satellites failed to ping back. Encryption layers were penetrated, rerouted, hijacked. What remained wasn't just silence. It was strategic silence. Surgical, devastating. Command infrastructure across multiple branches had been effectively severed. Emergency meetings were called. The thick black folders labeled "only to be opened in event of" were thrown onto the table. Officers huddled under stark lighting, flipping through contingency plans drafted for nightmares they hoped would never happen. But none of those binders could fix the fundamental truth hanging in the air like smoke. Without comms, without reach, they were deaf. They were blind. And Echo 6, still out there somewhere, was completely alone. They might be alive. They might be trapped. But right now, they were cut off, uncontactable, unreachable, and nobody in the room had any way of changing that. By the third hour, the pressure started cracking through the surface calm. The situation room, built to endure crisis, now buzzed with low murmurs, restless pacing. Fingers tapped against coffee cups. Eyes darted towards screens that stayed flatline. It was Lieutenant Avery Knox, a junior signals officer assigned to recovery operations, who broke the pattern. At a side console long left idle, Knox pulled up a file no one had opened in years. A redundancy map, Cold War era, analog-based, practically ancient. It listed low-frequency, ground-based radio channels designed to survive nuclear war or a total digital collapse. A last resort relic, tucked into archives for a doomsday that, until today, had been theoretical. Most of those stations had been shut down decades ago. Some were demolished. Others never existed beyond planning memos. But Knox, driven more by gut than protocol, ran a sweep anyway. He dusted off a receiver old enough to be in a museum and began slowly turning the dial. For 15 minutes, there was only static. Nothing. white noise and silence. Then faint, almost missed, a tone. Steady, repeating. Then a voice. Raspy, almost ghost-like. This is Whiskey J, broadcasting from the silent. Knox straightened, blinked, and cranked the gain. He patched the feed through the audio stabilizer, filtering out the background hiss. The voice came again, clearer now, paced and deliberate. Broadcasting low and clear, grid stable. This is Whiskey J. His hands moved fast. He opened the signal archive. There, tucked in a footnote, AM 760. A rogue broadcast that had been picked up occasionally over the years, somewhere from the Nevada desert. Flagged as unlicensed, presumed civilian. Likely hoax. No return signal, no coordinates, no ID, just a whisper. A myth. Whiskey J, a name that floated in communications circles like folklore. Knox didn't care. A signal was a signal, and right now it was the only one they had. He flagged it to command. The officers were skeptical. Eyes narrowed. One scoffed. Probably just a ham radio hobbyist pretending to be a Cold War operator, playing war games out in the desert. But then Knox gave them the second piece. The structure. The signal intervals weren't random. The waveform modulation matched exact specs of legacy military analog transmissions, patterns that hadn't been used since Vietnam. This was no amateur noise. A senior commander leaned in, voice sharp with tension. You're telling me someone is transmitting a military-grade analog signal from inside the continental U.S.? Usha, yes, sir, Knox said. And he's using the only frequency that's still getting through to Echo 6. A long shot, but the only shot. Knox got to work. He took Echo 6's last known coordinates, mission parameters, and distilled them into an analog transmission. Legacy Alpha cipher, format straight out of the 1960s. He repeated the burst message 4 times, then he waited. 2 minutes later, the console speaker popped, hissed, and then came the reply. Message received, relay confirmed, I'm on the air. Knox turned slowly to face the room, his voice quiet. Sir, someone answered. And just like that, Whiskey J wasn't a legend anymore. He was real, and he was the only line they had left. Walt Jennings was halfway through a section of a 1968 Army field manual, reading aloud into dead air, when something changed. It was subtle, a flicker in the headphones, the kind you only noticed after years of listening to static. The hum wavered just for a second, like a ghost brushing past. He paused, leaned forward, and tuned the frequency dial with slow precision. Static gave way to something jagged, something alive. He tapped the receiver twice, old school habit. Then, there it was. A voice, garbled, broken, but human. Echo 6 requesting evac. Hostiles inbound. Coordinates attached. Any station red, repeat. Any station red. Walt froze. The signal was faint, clearly bouncing off the ionosphere. Probably originated halfway around the world. But that didn't matter. He'd heard pirate signals before. Ramblers, old DJs, preachers, propaganda from nowhere. But this was different. This was real. Notebook and began calculating range arcs by hand, just like he used to. Each line he drew on the map brought him deeper into that familiar state, the one where time stopped and only the mission mattered. A tiny voice in the back of his mind whispered that he might be chasing ghosts, but he shut it out. Ghosts don't bleed, and whoever sent that message was out there bleeding, running, holding a perimeter with nothing but short-range rounds in desperation. He leaned in close, eyes flicking between the map and the console, adjusting the tuning dial with micro-movements. The signal had flared stronger the second time. Clean, tight, panicked. It wasn't kids playing dress-up. That cadence didn't come from a script. It came from the field. From fear. From training. From years of learning how to keep breathing while everyone else fell. Walt felt the old rhythm slip back into his bones. It was as if the past had cracked open and poured itself into the present, thick and undeniable. Echo 6. No one used that designation anymore. Not officially, not since they'd buried the last records under layers of bureaucratic cement. But he remembered it. Hell, he lived it. His fingers flew across the control panel now. setting a relay bounce off an old shortwave satellite loop that should have been decommissioned years ago. The override was dirty, held together with copper tape and faith, but it caught. The frequency stabilized. He patched in a narrowband repeater through the booster and redirected the antenna array 5 degrees east. Then he spoke into the mic again, steady this time, controlled. Echo 6, this is Whiskey J. I have you on grid 37 Delta. Repeat, 37 Delta, confirmed. Hold your position. Reinforcements are being notified. Stay on this frequency. Repeat, stay on this frequency. I'm your relay. You are not alone. The words sounded official, practiced. But Walt knew Bosch better. He was making this up as he went, flying on instinct and grit. There were no reinforcements. Not yet. Not unless he could reach someone who still had boots on the ground and a reason to listen. He wasn't military anymore. Wasn't anything anymore, not on paper. Just an old man with a patchwork station in the back of a forgotten woodshed and a stubborn refusal to let silence win. A burst of static buzzed through the speaker. Then another voice, faint but clearer than before. Whiskey J, this is Echo 6, copy last. Holding at coordinates. 3 wounded. Repeat, 3 down. Time critical. Hostiles regrouping. Do you read? Walt's breath caught, chest tightening. The voice sounded young. Too young, but the words were crisp, drilled, disciplined. He closed his eyes for a second, then opened them and keyed the mic again. Echo 6, I read you. Sit tight. Keep transmissions brief. You're burning hot and we've only got so much power. I'm working the relays. Help is coming. He reached under the desk and yanked a coil of auxiliary cable, dragging it across the floor toward a side module he hadn't powered in 20 years. The backup frequency switchboard. It ran on an outdated protocol, but it was his best shot at widening the range. Dust flew as he pried the case open, coughing as years of grime puffed into his face. The board's internal battery had leaked into the circuitry. He cursed under his breath and grabbed his soldering kit, scraping corrosion away with the precision of a surgeon. Hands steady, mind sharp. He patched a bypass wire, shorted a resistor, and jammed the casing shut. Lights flickered back to life. The board began scanning auxiliary bands for a compatible repeat. Walt wiped the sweat from his brow with the sleeve of his flannel and leaned forward, eyeing the gauges. They were holding. Barely. His transmitter was burning hot, hotter than it ever had. He knew he was pushing the system past its limits. But if the call dropped now, if Echo 6 fell into static and never came back, he'd never forgive himself. He didn't stop to think about how ridiculous it was. An old man in the middle of nowhere trying to coordinate a battlefield evac through analog tech and grit. But deep down, he knew this was no accident. All those years of tinkering, maintaining, staying ready when there was no reason to. This was why. It had always been about more than nostalgia. It was about still being part of something. About still mattering. He keyed the mic again, voice calm but urgent. Echo 6, we're building your corridor. Sit tight. Mark all movement. Do not break transmission unless compromised. I'm here, we're holding the line. Outside, the wind howled through the trees. Inside, the shack thrummed with life. Walt stood, a figure in shadow, lit by the glow of old machines and the crackling pulse of one improbable connection. Man to man, past to present, one voice refusing to vanish. For the first time in decades, Walt Jennings wasn't just listening anymore. He was being heard. The edge of a breakdown with a rig that's more scrap metal than signal cores. One of the junior analysts leaned toward Kelton, concern etched into his features. But the general didn't flinch. I said, leave him be, Kelton replied, voice ironclad. You let that old man do what he does. He's got more battlefield hours than half this room put together. Back in Nevada, the desert air was dry and biting through the cracks in the shelter's corrugated steel walls. Walt's skin itched with the cold, sweat freezing on his back. He sat hunched over the panel, jacket discarded, sleeves rolled, hands trembling from the adrenaline surge that wouldn't let up. He didn't notice the blood where the panel cut him, didn't feel the burn where the relay had scorched his palm. He only knew the pattern, the rhythm of the signal, the whine of the capacitor spool, the crackle right before each loop broadcast engaged. The message cycled again. Echo 6, this is Whiskey J. Coordinates received. Transmission stable. Do not break contact. Hold your ground. He couldn't tell if they heard him. He couldn't tell if they were even still alive. But he repeated the message again anyway, adding a few words this time. You're not alone out there. Keep breathing. Keep talking. Then he rewound the reel just enough to overlap the message cleanly before letting it run live again. The tape hissed as it rolled, the motor whining in protest, but it held. Walt leaned closer to the amplifier, eyes narrowed, listening for anomalies, signal drift, low-range bleed, a skip in the carrier frequency. Nothing. Clean, still holding. He let out a shaky breath, feeling the tremor in his ribs. For a second, he allowed himself to close his eyes. Just a second. And that's when it hit again. A low pop, then a flash. Another surge arcing from the corner of the wall-mounted junction box. He cursed and threw himself toward it, smothering the flare with a bundled towel. The air filled with scorched plastic and ozone. He ripped open the casing, yanked the failed line, and rewired the contacts in place, barehanded. His fingers blistered instantly, but he didn't stop. Couldn't. Behind him, the recorder continued its cycle. Walt tuned back in just in time to catch the final loop as it ended. He slapped the mic again. Echo 6, this is Whiskey J. Still with you. Signal clean. Hold your ground, boys. I've got your 6. And for a heartbeat, he thought he heard something. A faint click. A whisper of static modulation not from his end. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was wind. Or maybe it was one of them. Maybe one of the 6 had found enough strength to hit their mic and whisper back. He didn't say anything this time. Just reached over, touched the corner of the old radio like it was an altar, and sat down hard. In the Pentagon's dim war room, the screen flickered again. New logs scrolled down the feed, more signal confirmations. Echo 6's location verified multiple times. Each message carried a timestamp, each one matching the low-frequency relay. The line was still active. Colonel Mallister was silent now, arms folded. The young lieutenant beside her watched the signal trace stabilize in real time. It was as if the line itself had grown roots, anchoring their hope in this analog ghost channel from a forgotten part of the country. Kelton watched them all. Then he spoke again, low but firm. Get support ready. They've held position this long, they'll hold a little longer. But you give Jennings everything he needs. Every watt, every spare line. Hell, mail him a goddamn fuse box if you have to. That man is the difference between silence and salvation. One of the aides spoke up. Sir, if he goes down. Kelton didn't hesitate. Then we lose them, all of them. And in that underground shelter in the middle of nowhere, with his sweat drying in streaks, his fingers burnt raw, and the room still thick with smoke, Walt Jennings adjusted the volume dial half a notch. Not too loud, not too soft. Just right for a signal to be heard. Or we think to be heard, far beyond the reach of hope. And the desert listened. Kelton's eyes narrowed, the glow of the monitors casting hard shadows across his face. Unlicensed hardware, he thought again, unable to believe it. And yet here they were, surrounded by state-of-the-art systems, some of the most advanced communications tech the military had ever fielded, still rebooting, still stalling. Meanwhile, an old analog rig, built by a man the brass had long written off, was outperforming half the room. No delays, no errors, just results. He didn't say anything else for a moment. He didn't have to. The room had already shifted around him. Movement became urgent, deliberate. A special operations comms team had been assigned full-time to monitor Walt Jennings' signal. Engineers scrambled to digitally mirror his analog stream, building in layers of redundancy in case his rig ever failed. The CIA, skeptical at first, had offered to reroute satellite flyovers to verify Echo 6's coordinates directly. But even they had to admit the truth aloud. Without the feed from Whiskey J, Echo 6 was flying blind. And just like that, in under an hour, Walter Jennings, once ghosted, once laughed out of the command structure, had become the single most critical node in the entire chain of U.S. military operations. He wasn't just a signal anymore. He was the signal. Kelton stood at the head of the operations table, arms crossed, eyes locked on the green light, blinking in rhythm, each pulse signaling that Walt was still there, still transmitting. He allowed himself the faintest smile, one that didn't reach his eyes, and muttered under his breath, "Still listening, huh, Walt, you old bastard?" For the first time in days, the room felt like it had purpose again. The fog of helplessness lifted as a new current of energy began to hum through the air. It was subtle, almost sacred. At exactly 7:60 a.m., hope made its quiet return. Because the man they'd forgotten never forgot how to listen. Thousands of miles away, deep in the Nevada desert, Walt Jennings hadn't moved from his post. The shack buzzed quietly under the red emergency lamp, casting soft light over the battered equipment. The transmitter hummed steadily, its signal meter glowing in rhythmic pulses. Walt hadn't blinked in hours. A clipboard lay beside him, edges curled, filled with neat, hand-drawn logs, loops of transmission times, signal strength notes, field conditions. Echo 6's coordinates had been received, confirmed, and translated into clean relays, and sent it out again. Over and over, dozens of times, he made sure every cycle went out at full power. 7-second bursts filled with coded confirmations, terrain adjustments, evac route markers, coordinates repeated in multiple time codes and encodings. The shack trembled occasionally under power surges. The backup coil hissed like a living thing in the heat, but Walt didn't flinch, didn't even look up. His hands simply moved, tuning, adjusting, soldering, keeping the line alive. His fingers were red and blistered from mid-transmission repairs. He had replaced a capacitor with shaking hands and the tip of a rusted screwdriver. He hadn't eaten. He had only sipped at lukewarm water, but his voice never wavered. Echo 6, this is Whiskey J, he transmitted, low and steady. Your coordinates are strong. Hold your position. Air assets en route. You're not alone. Far away, 6,000 meters across harsh terrain, hidden in the unforgiving foothills of the barren range straddling the Afghanistan-Pakistan border, the men of Echo 6 crouched in silence. Meltwater soaked their boots. The air was thin, dry, and bit deep into their lungs with each breath. 2 men were wounded. 1 lay unconscious. And for a long, terrible stretch of time, they'd resigned themselves to the thought that no one was coming. Now they listened. At first it was faint, barely audible, but it was there, a low, distant thump, thump, thump. Then it grew louder, sharper, rhythmic and unmistakable. Reese, the team leader, snapped his head up, heart pounding. That sound, it was salvation. Rotors. The darkness ahead burst apart with movement as a Black Hawk helicopter cleared the eastern ridgeline, skimming low in blackout formation. 2 Apaches followed, silent shadows on either side. Their navigation lights were off, just as Walt had said. Dust erupted like a sandstorm as the Black Hawk dipped hard toward the landing zone Echo 6 had marked. Thermal flare and smoke, right where Whiskey J told them to drop it. "Let's move," Reese shouted. The team sprang into action. 1 man lifted the unconscious soldier onto his back. Another limped behind, weapon up. The rest flanked the movement, covering their retreat. Before the Black Hawk even hit the dirt, the rear ramp dropped. 2 crewmen jumped out, waving them forward with urgency. Reese yanked the comms handset from his gear and twisted the knob to the backup frequency, an old open band they'd kept clear since day 1. In the deafening roar of wind, engine, and swirling grit, he raised the mic. "Whiskey J, if you can hear this, we owe you our lives." The team surged up the ramp. The door slammed shut. The bird rose sharply, banking fast into the night sky. Gunfire cracked behind them from the ridgeline, but the Apaches roared to life with a counter barrage. Rounds lit up the night. The Black Hawk didn't stop. It punched into the dark and didn't look back. Back in the Nevada shack, Walt heard the transmission come through, buried under static but clear enough. He didn't respond at first. His shoulders dropped as he finally let himself relax. He stared at the blinking signal light on his rig, green, unwavering, alive. Slowly he reached for the mic, his voice worn but unwavering. "You boys don't owe me a damn thing," he said. "Just get home." He released the button. The click echoed softly in the quiet room. He took off his headset, set it down on the desk, and leaned back. Behind him, the reel-to-reel recorder continued its steady spin. A final loop played on repeat, quiet but steady in the hum of the shack. "Mission received. Echo 6 safe." Walt leaned back in his chair, eyes drifting toward the dusty window pane. Beyond it, the old antenna tower still stood defiant in the distance, Weather-beaten and scarred by time, its rusted joints held together by little more than memory and quiet faith. Wind howled through the open desert, tugging at its steel frame, but it held, just like him. He said nothing more. He didn't have to. His duty was fulfilled. For decades, Walt Jennings, Whiskey J, had manned this humble radio post, waiting through static-filled nights and long, silent days. He had waited without knowing if anyone was listening, if the signal meant anything at all. But he had believed. He had hoped. And in the end, he had been right. 6 voices had answered. 6 men, Echo 6, had been saved. Because one stubborn old man never turned off the radio. Because Walt never missed a call. 1 week later, a military correspondent from Stars and Stripes made the long, lonely drive into the Nevada desert to find the man behind the miracle story that had gone viral across military circles. The silent guardian who saved a squad without ever leaving his shack. But by the time the reporter arrived, he was too late. The cabin sat quiet under a sky full of sun and dust. The screen door creaked open with the wind, revealing the still interior. A low hum filled the air, steady, unwavering. The transmitter was still running. On the desk, beside a worn microphone, an old headset rested on its side. A reel-to-reel recorder had frozen mid-loop. The tape stopped, but not rewound. The red light on the transmitter glowed, a silent pulse. No voice came through, but the current lived on. Walt Jennings had passed during the night, seated in the same chair from which he'd made his final transmission. There were no signs of distress, no struggle, just a man who had completed his purpose. Above the desk, nailed to the wall, hung a photograph. Walt and his son Eddie, both in uniform, both smiling beneath a gently waving American flag. The frame was scratched and faded, but the image remained untouched by time. Next to the photo was a single note, handwritten and folded once, carefully placed atop the station log. It read, "To anyone still listening, never turn off the signal." The reporter stood in stillness, absorbing the quiet. He didn't touch a thing. He didn't need to. By nightfall, Walt's story had broken into national headlines. News anchors, military forums, veterans networks, every corner of the internet echoed with his name. Civilians were moved by the quiet dignity of his sacrifice. But it was the soldiers, those who knew what it meant to survive by a voice in the dark, who spoke the loudest. They called him a legend, a watchman, the last signal man. The men of Echo 6 gave public statements, each one naming Walt. "He was the voice we didn't know we needed," one of them said, "but the one that never gave up on us." A week later, the Army Corps of Engineers arrived. They didn't dismantle the tower. Instead, they installed a modest metal plaque at the base of Walt's antenna, just outside the shack he never left. It read, "This frequency once saved lives. In silence, he spoke the loudest." Walter Jennings, Whiskey J, 1941 to 2023. They left the tower standing, its signal still humming faintly through the dry desert wind. Some nights, if you tune to 760, they say you can still catch the faint hiss of static, maybe even a whisper if you listen closely enough. Because some frequencies don't die. They linger, they endure, and they remember, especially when someone like Walt once kept them alive. Some signals never go out. They might weaken. They might get drowned in noise. But they wait. They wait for someone willing to listen. Walt Jennings was never a man who chased attention. He didn't care about recognition. He showed up night after night because he believed that somewhere, someone might need to hear one honest voice cutting through the dark. In this loud, frantic world of ours, maybe that's what we've lost. Steadfastness, a quiet commitment, a little more of what Walt stood for. Do your part even when no one's watching, especially when no one's watching. This wasn't just a story about a radio signal. It was about duty. About the quiet, steady power of one person doing the right thing, even when the world thinks it no longer matters. Walt's story isn't over. It lives on in the voices he saved, in the frequency still whispering through the static. Somewhere out there, someone might be listening, just like he once did.